Hello everyone. My name is Mr. Rage. Welcome back to another one of my discussion videos. Hope you guys are doing well today. So before I get into the topic of this video, I just want to quickly give a little disclaimer. The views in this video are based 100% on my own personal opinion. So if you do not agree with some of the things I say in this video, that is completely fine. No need to be toxic. And yeah, without further ado, let's get straight into the discussion video. Now, I have said this many times on my channel before, especially when talking about Resident Evil and survival horror games in general. Resident Evil 5 and 6 are not good Resident Evil games, and I will even go as far as to say they are the worst Resident Evil games in the franchise. I mean, Resident Evil 5 is definitely not as bad as Resident Evil 6, because the thing about Resident Evil 6 is Resident Evil 6 is a terrible game in general. Not only does Resident Evil 6 fail as a Resident Evil game, it even fails as an action game. That game did not do anything right. It failed as a Resident Evil game. It failed as an action game. It failed as a game in general. Fuck Resident Evil 6. That game can go straight to hell. But Resident Evil 5... I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that Resident Evil 5 is a bad game, because if I told you that, then I would be lying. I would also be lying if I said that I did not enjoy my time with Resident Evil 5. I do not hate this game. I actually think that Resident Evil 5 is a really fun action game. Now, the reason why I don't like Resident Evil 5 is because it's a Resident Evil game. Like, why is this a Resident Evil game? It may have the Resident Evil title, it may have Resident Evil characters, but for the most part, Resident Evil 5 is not a Resident Evil game. I mean, if this was just some random action game, then I would not hate it. Because Resident Evil 5, like I said, is a very fun action game. But the fact that this is an entry in the Resident Evil franchise is the reason why I don't like it. I mean, if I played Resident Evil 5 before I played any other Resident Evil game, I would assume that Resident Evil was an action franchise rather than a survival horror franchise. And that's why I don't like Resident Evil 5, because it goes down the wrong road. It goes down a road with spikes on it, because Resident Evil 5 is just not a good Resident Evil game. It is a good action game, but as a Resident Evil game, it fails. And anyone who denies this, I don't know what to say. I mean, why do you think Resident Evil 5 is a Resident Evil game? Like, tell me, how is Resident Evil 5 a Resident Evil game? The survival horror elements are gone. The exploration has been severely downgraded, and so has the puzzles. The game is actually a level-based shooter. Everything that made Resident Evil is completely gone in Resident Evil 5. You have very slight puzzle solving, which a toddler could probably solve, and very little exploration, considering the fact that the levels in this game are very, very small. So everything that made Resident Evil is completely gone in Resident Evil 5. This is not a Resident Evil game, alright? I'm sorry, but it's not. But this does not mean that Resident Evil 5 is a bad game. Resident Evil 5 was a well-designed co-op action shooter. But that's exactly the reason why I just do not like this entry, because it's just not a Resident Evil game. I mean, I don't understand. Why did Capcom even put so much action in Resident Evil 5? People loved Resident Evil 4 not because of all of its action, but because it done such a fantastic job at taking action and horror and blending them so well. I mean, Capcom took action and horror and put them together like peanut butter and jelly with Resident Evil 4. And then when Resident Evil 5 came along, they turned it into fucking Call of Duty. I don't get it. Like, this is not why people loved Resident Evil 4. I'm not sure what Capcom thought they were doing by making Resident Evil 5 more of an action game. That's not why people loved Resident Evil 4. They loved Resident Evil 4 because it had a great story, it was a fun but terrifying game at times, and also because of its great characters. I mean, I'm not going to say that Chris is not a bad character. I mean, I also enjoyed Shiva as well, but Resident Evil 5 also really lacks in story and character as well. We'll talk about that in a minute, but Resident Evil 5 is nowhere near as good of a game as Resident Evil 4 was. I used to be one of those people who thought that Resident Evil 4 was also responsible for ruining the Resident Evil franchise, but I no longer think that way, because when I look back at Resident Evil 4, I realized that Resident Evil 4, although it did have a lot of action, more than the original Resident Evils, it did not go completely 100% balls to the wall action like Resident Evil 5 did. Resident Evil 4 still retained its horror elements, and that enough is what made it a Resident Evil game. That's why, although it had action, Resident Evil 4 still feels like a Resident Evil game, except for Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 does not feel like a Resident Evil game. This feels more like, I don't know, Spec Ops The Line or something, or Gears of War. It feels like another third-person shooter. It doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game. It doesn't feel like a horror game, like, let alone a survival horror game. Resident Evil 5 is not even scary. There are barely any single scary moments in Resident Evil 5. There are some slight scary moments, and some of the boss fights are pretty freaky, and the boss fights in general are fun. But you see, that's not what we're talking about here. Resident Evil 5, yes, we've already explained that Resident Evil 5 is a fun action game, but that's why it's not a good Resident Evil game. And back to what I was saying about Resident Evil 4, yes, Resident Evil 4 did have a lot of action, more so than the original Resident Evil games, but it still had those horror elements because Capcom didn't put all their focus on the action side. They took survival horror and action and mixed them together. And that is why Resident Evil 4 was such a revolutionary game in the Resident Evil franchise, because it done such an amazing thing. It took two gameplay elements that you would never think would go well together, and somehow they made it fit perfectly together. Survival horror and action. And not only that, but the action in Resident Evil 4, it didn't make you feel like this unstoppable badass like it is in Resident Evil 5. The combat in Resident Evil 4, as well as the action, it feels intense and thrilling. You don't feel like you're a soldier in a Call of Duty game just killing everything with your guns. Resident Evil 4, at the end of the day, is still a survival horror game that just has more action in it. Resident Evil 5, however, does not have any of these elements. Yes, the combat is intense, but there's too much of it. I mean, if we're going to talk more about Resident Evil 5, let me quickly start by explaining that Resident Evil 5's combat is actually really, really repetitive. The game never has a cooldown moment. This game literally has you doing the same thing over and over and over again. Just fighting bad guys, then fighting a boss, and that's it. The game does have some slight puzzle solving, but these are extremely easy, okay? I'm a retard with ADHD, and even I can solve these puzzles. So, the puzzles in Resident Evil 5 are extremely downgraded, so is the exploration, and obviously so is the horror elements. This is why Resident Evil 5 fails as a Resident Evil game. If Capcom would have cared more about putting more horror elements in Resident Evil 5 like Resident Evil 4, then maybe Resident Evil 5 would have been more like a traditional Resident Evil entry. But for whatever reason, they put so much focus on action, and I don't understand why. I'm pretty sure it's because of those shitty Resident Evil films. Capcom probably saw how popular they were, and obviously those Resident Evil movies were complete dog shit. Nothing but cheesy-ass action films. And then they turned Resident Evil 5 into a cheesy action movie simulator. So it's probably those garbage-ass Resident Evil movies, except for I thought Capcom had nothing to do with those. So it's kind of strange, but anyways, yeah, this is why Resident Evil 5 doesn't deserve a remake, because as you guys may or may not know, at the end of Resident Evil 4 Remake, Resident Evil 5 Remake was basically hinted at. And the reason why I don't think Resident Evil 5 deserves a remake is because, well, like I said earlier, Resident Evil 5 does not feel like a Resident Evil game, nor is it a Resident Evil game. And not only that, but Resident Evil 5 also almost killed the franchise. And not because, you know, it's a bad game. You know, the co-op, everything. Resident Evil 5 is a good game, but the reason why it almost killed the Resident Evil franchise is because Resident Evil 5 took the Resident Evil franchise into a very, very bad direction. And that very bad direction is exactly what led to the creation of Resident Evil 6, which was a complete abomination in the Resident Evil franchise. One of the worst games ever. Anyway, sorry about that. Yeah, so that's why Resident Evil 5 does not deserve a remake, because it took the Resident Evil franchise down a very bad path, a very bad road. If it wasn't for Resident Evil 7, then we could already pretty much say that Resident Evil 5 did kill the franchise. I mean, thank God for Resident Evil 7, because if Resident Evil 7 never came along, then the Resident Evil franchise would probably be dead, just like Silent Hill. And not only that, but, you know, the thing about action is I like action horror games. But notice how I said horror games, action horror games? I like horror games that do have action. What I don't like, however, is when a survival horror franchise completely abandons its horror elements and turns into an action movie simulator. You see, the reason why I really don't like Resident Evil 5 is because I became a fan of the Resident Evil franchise because it was survival horror. I didn't become a big fan of the Resident Evil franchise because it was some boring-ass action movie simulator. I became a fan of Resident Evil because it was an amazing survival horror experience, and I think I could say the same for any other OG Resident Evil fans who also do not like Resident Evil 5 and 6. You guys became fans of this franchise because it was survival horror. The Resident Evil franchise was great in general because it was an amazing survival horror franchise. I mean, Resident Evil started the survival horror franchise. So that's why people loved Resident Evil, because it was an amazing survival horror franchise. So the fact that Resident Evil 5 took the franchise such a completely different path, and not a very good one, is why I do not think Resident Evil 5 deserves a remake. Now, not only that, but as you guys know, Capcom is trying to take the Resident Evil franchise back to its survival horror roots, and it is doing a very good job at that. And you see, again, talking a little bit about the action, Resident Evil has always had a little bit of action. If, like, for my older gamers around here, you know, who's been playing since the 90s, if you guys played the OG Resident Evil 3, like for the PS1, Resident Evil 3, the classic OG Resident Evil 3, had a lot more action elements than Resident Evil 1 and 2. See, Resident Evil has always had action elements, but you see, the thing that was, the reason why it wasn't a bad thing is because Capcom done such a great job at balancing survival horror and action. You know, they never put too much focus on one of them. They took survival horror and action and mixed them up. And that's what made the formula of Resident Evil so good. That's what made Resident Evil 4 such a good game. That's why people love Resident Evil 4. Because the fact that it blends action and survival horror into one amazingly executed game is why people loved Resident Evil 4. Because of how well Capcom took action and survival horror. Now, if Capcom was to do a remake of Resident Evil 5, how exactly are they going to make Resident Evil 5 Remake better than the original? Sure, they can make the controls better, they can make the gameplay more smoother, but I'm not talking about that. Like I just said, Capcom is trying to take the Resident Evil franchise back to its survival horror roots. If Capcom was to remake Resident Evil 5, you do realize that they will be making another action game, right? And that's why this is a problem, because we don't want more action Resident Evil. We want survival horror action Resident Evil. Now, what Capcom could do, if they do remake Resident Evil 5, what they could do is they could possibly implement more survival horror elements into a Resident Evil 5 remake. You know, they can make it more like a classic Resident Evil entry, or they can make it more like the Resident Evil 4 remake, except for with co-op. Now, although this can work out, the reason why I think this will be a little too hard is because, let me tell you something. Resident Evil 4 was not a very hard game to remake because Capcom did not have to redesign and remake the design and concept of Resident Evil 4. The design and concept of Resident Evil 4 did not change with the Resident Evil 4 remake. All Capcom did was just update the gameplay, make it more modernized, and add in some new elements. None of those elements had anything to do with, had nothing to do with action. Resident Evil 5, however, Resident Evil 5 design and the concept is action. If Capcom was to do a remake of Resident Evil 5, they will have to remake the whole game. They will have to change the whole game, because you see, the thing about Resident Evil 4 is, like I said, Resident Evil 4 was not a very hard game to remake because they didn't have to change the design or the concept. Resident Evil 5, on the other hand, the design of Resident Evil 5 is action. Okay, you got to admit. Okay, Resident Evil 5 was designed as an action game. So if Capcom was to do a remake of Resident Evil 5, they are going to have to essentially remake the whole game from scratch. And this will be pretty difficult too. And also, I understand that this game does have fans, and some people may not like Resident Evil 5 turning into a more survival horror game, but I'm gonna be honest with you. I think Resident Evil 5 should have been more of a survival horror game. I mean, the setting, the story. I mean, even though the story of Resident Evil 5 was not as good as Resident Evil 4, I think Resident Evil 5 would have actually been better if it was a survival horror game. So, you know, I understand that this game does have fans, but if Capcom does do a remake of Resident Evil 5, they need to implement more horror elements, because the OG Resident Evil 5 has absolutely none of them. I mean, like I said, the design of Resident Evil 5 is action. So if they was going to do a remake, Capcom will have to change the design and remake the design all the way from scratch. It'll be like making a whole new Resident Evil sequel, even though they're not. So yeah, this is why I don't think Resident Evil 5 deserves an action game, because I just don't think it's worth it, because Resident Evil 5 is an action game. Like, why remake Resident Evil 5 when it's not a survival horror game? I mean, the reason why Capcom is doing all these Resident Evil remakes in general is because they are trying to basically make Resident Evil more of a survival horror franchise again. You know, that's why they made Resident Evil 2 and 3 and 4, because these games are survival horror just like the original Resident Evils were. Resident Evil 5 is not a survival horror game. I will say that again. Resident Evil 5 is not a survival horror game. Resident Evil 5 is not a Resident Evil game in general. This is why it does not deserve a remake, nor do I think it is even necessary. Resident Evil 5 is fine just where it is. You know, this is a game that should just be remembered as that one crazy action entry that Resident Evil got like a long time ago. You know, that's why it does not deserve a remake, because I think it's fine just the way it is, and we also just don't need it. Because like I said earlier, again, if Capcom does remake Resident Evil 5, it's going to be another action game, and that is something I do not want. I do not want another Resident Evil game that focuses completely on the action. As much as I like action in my video games, when it comes to Resident Evil, I like action and horror, not just action. You know, this is why I loved The Evil Within, because as you guys know, The Evil Within, like Resident Evil 4, done a great job at blending survival horror, puzzle solving, and action, which made the experience an amazing one for survival horror fans. Because the thing about action is good for horror games, because action is fun, it's intense. Like, intense action combat in horror games is actually better for the horror, because you could, like, imagine, like, you'll be facing, like, extremely terrifying and hard to kill enemies. That's what made The Evil Within so good. That's what made Resident Evil 4 so good. So action is good for survival horror, but not to the point where there is no more survival horror. That's what I'm saying. That's why Resident Evil 5 doesn't deserve a remake, because Resident Evil 5 does not have any horror elements whatsoever. Except for a couple of the boss fights. And, you know, just for the boss fights in the co-op, I'm sure a Resident Evil 5 remake would be a very fun game to play, but I just don't think it's worth it. Because, like I said earlier, I don't want more action I don't want more action in the Resident Evil franchise, you know, because Capcom is trying to go back to the survival horror roots. They're not trying to go back to the action roots, you know? So, yeah, that's why I do not think Resident Evil 5 deserves a remake. You know, just too much action. I mean, if they do a remake, like I said, if they do a Resident Evil 5 remake, there needs to be more horror elements. They need to implement more horror elements. They need to add back the survival horror elements that made Resident Evil 4 and others so good. You know, even games like even Dead Space has action in it. But you see, the thing about Dead Space is the enemies in Dead Space are terrifying, and they also are very dangerous towards the player. So when you're fighting enemies in Dead Space, the combat is intense, the action is intense, the action still is scary, actually, because of the enemies and how intense the combat is. Resident Evil 5 is not even intense. Like, you know, I'm going to do a remake. I'm going to do a review of Resident Evil 5 so that way I could talk just completely about this game, because I'm sure you guys are curious to hear my thoughts and everything. But, yeah, anyways, if you guys stuck by till the end, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And, yeah, that's why I don't think Resident Evil 5 deserves a remake. To be completely honest, I really think Capcom should just stop with this whole remake trend in general. I really don't think there's any more Resident Evil games they should remake, except for, like, Code Veronica or something. But, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you stuck by till the end, thank you so much for hearing me rant. And, yeah, I will see you guys in the next discussion video. Take care, y'all. Peace.